So as you'll no doubt remember from last week, the first English settlers came to the Chesapeake area, now Virginia, in 1607. The land the English found was of course already inhabited by Indian tribes unified under the leadership of Chief Wahunsonica, and I will remind you that mispronouncing things is my thing! The English called this chief Powhatan, because of course mispronouncing things was also their thing. Powhatan was actually his title and the name of his tribe, but to say that the English lacked cultural sensitivity would be an understatement. So as previously noted, relationships, whether between individuals or collectives, tend to go well when they are mutually beneficial, and for a while, both the English and the Indians were better off for these interactions. I mean, post-smallpox. The Virginia Company existed to make money, and since the Chesapeake lacked gold or silver, making money required trade. The English liked to fence in some of their land, which kept the Indians off it, and also the English let their pigs and cattle roam freely, and the animals would eat natives' crops. And as Europeans' appetite for furs grew, Indian tribes began to fight with each other over access to the best hunting grounds, leading to intertribal warfare, which suddenly included guns. But this was still a relatively calm time. Despite not marrying Pocahontas, John Smith is still important to this story because when he left Virginia for England after being injured in a gunpowder explosion, things between the Native Americans and the English immediately began to deteriorate. How? Well, the English went back to stealing Indians' crops and also began stealing their lives via massacres. It had become abundantly clear that more and more English were going to show up, and they weren't just there to trade, they wanted to take Indian land. But the English struck back, as empires will, and the uprising of 1622 ultimately failed. And after another failed uprising in 1644, the 2,000 remaining Native Americans were forced to sign a treaty that consigned them to reservations in the West, well, the west of Virginia at least. But the 1622 uprising was the final nail in the coffin of the Virginia Company, which was a failure in every way. While some of the Puritans who settled in New England, notably Roger Williams, tried to treat the Indians fairly, in general it was very similar to what we saw in the Chesapeake. Settlers thought Native Americans could be replaced because they weren't properly using the land. New England's native population lacked an overarching leader like Powhatan, but by 1637 the inevitable conflict between the English and the Indians did happen. It was called the Pequot War. After some Pequots killed an English fur trader, soldiers from Massachusetts, the newly formed colony of Connecticut, and some Narragansett Indians who saw an opportunity to gain an upper hand over the Pequots attacked a Pequot village at Mystic, burning it and massacring over 500 people. The war continued for a few months after this, but to call it a war is in a way to give it too much credit. The Indians were overmatched from the beginning, and by the end, almost all of them had been massacred or sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The war opened up the Connecticut River to further settlement. It also showed that Native Americans were going to have a tough time resisting because they were outnumbered and they had inferior weapons. In 1675, Native Americans launched their biggest attack on New England colonists in what would come to be known as King Philip's War. It was led by a Wampanoag chief named Metacom, which is why it is also sometimes called Metacom's War. The English called Metacom King Philip due to their fantastic cultural sensitivity. The conflict was marked by brutality on both sides, and it nearly ended English settlements in the Northeast. The fighting itself lasted 2 years. Indians attacked half of the 90 towns the English had founded, and 12 of those towns were destroyed. About 1,000 of the 52,000 Europeans and 3,000 of the 20,000 Indians involved died in the war. This shows us the way the Puritans understand the world, but it also shows us that within 50 years of its founding, Puritans already felt that the mission of their colony to be a great Christian community was already kind of a failure. If they'd been as righteous as they were supposed to be, God wouldn't have sent the Indians to burn their homes and kill them. So it's important to understand that this was a war to preserve a way of life for both the Indians and the English.